You're listening to Eating for Eden, episode 16. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden. I'm thrilled to welcome another guest to the show today, Dr. Alan Flanagan. Alan is a post-doctoral research fellow in chrononutrition at the University of Surrey in the UK and holds a PhD and master's degree in nutrition science from the same institution. Alan is the founder of Alinea Nutrition, an online education hub for nutrition and healthcare professionals. Alan is also Research Communication Officer for Sigma Nutrition, where he co-hosts the world's leading evidence-based nutrition podcast with Sigma Nutrition founder Danny Lennon. Originally a lawyer by background in Dublin, Ireland, Alan spent a decade practicing as a barrister before moving into science. Alan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. As regular listeners to the show will be aware, while the focus here is considering how what we eat impacts the environment, it's also crucial to consider other factors of our food choices. The more we understand about the multifaceted impact our food choices have, the better equipped we will be to consistently make the best choices that we can. So today we're diving headfirst into nutrition, which I'm super stoked about because I'm a bit of a nutrition nerd, even though I don't have any formal training. That's where Alan comes in. So first things first, Alan. Initially, you trained and worked as a lawyer or barrister. So what compelled you to leave practicing law to study nutrition?
It was, I would say, a gradual evolution. The initial impetus, I had always been quite interested in nutrition, even in secondary school or high school, as you would call it there. I played a lot of sports. And I was kind of one of these, like average good players, but not great. So I was always looking for things that could make me better, whether that was training or nutrition or something. And initially, it was just a subject that quite interested me. And that kind of stayed with me then. I never considered nutrition at the time. It didn't even occur to me that it was a field, of study or practice or anything. Because, food is something so ubiquitous to us, we all eat. So I kind of went on my academic interests at the time and just followed that. And I studied history and English for my undergraduate degree, which led into law school, and then qualified as a barrister and started practicing. And then I kind of found myself thinking about the nutrition stuff as I was kind of going on, and I was becoming interested more in public health kind of level of what was going on. And, very obviously we have a public health crisis, so to speak, for which I would never oversell the role of nutrition. And sometimes it's like it's all just what we're eating. It's not. There are multiple lifestyle factors and changes in the way we, have leisure time, physical activity, all of these kind of stuff, stress. But diet is a massive component of this. And I was particularly interested in that. So I thought initially I would kind of dip my toe into some study to see whether I liked that aspect to it. And I did a diploma course originally just on weekends, but that got the kind of enthusiasm for, I would like to study this if I can at a higher level. So I went on to apply for a master's that I was lucky enough that they kind of keep a few positions aside for people from kind of non-traditional or non-scientific backgrounds. And I was very much at the time not thinking about leaving law. My angle at the time was that I would, do the master's in nutrition, and that would perhaps be something that could help me in law start to kind of go more towards health legislation, regulation policy. By the end of my master's, different pictures emerged. I really fell in love with research, and my own research project that I did for my MSc. I really enjoyed that. And so when an opportunity for a full-time PhD came up, I was still in law full-time, and I just had to weigh up, do I do this? Do I not? And one of the things about legal practice is it's not uncommon for people to kind of go away. You see a lot of people, for example, would go into politics, and then when they finish in government, they come back to legal practice, etc. And on the advice of some of my mentors, they said, well, it's only 3 years, so you could go away, do your PhD, and if you don't want to, you can come back. And I never came back, basically. So the rest is kind of history. So yeah, it started out as a very kind of informal interest that I tested the waters with, and that kind of led to further study. And really, the master's was what kind of had me really bitten by the research bug, but also kind of crystallized that perhaps there was a potential career here in research itself, and that's where I still am.
Yeah, I mean, this is just me intuiting from what I've heard on Sigma Nutrition and other episodes that you've been on and other podcasts, but it seems like your background in law probably makes you really good at what you're doing in terms of assessing research and seeing how things do and don't line up in terms of what people are how they're interpreting the research,
Mm.
et cetera.
I agree with you wholeheartedly now, and it's a point that only lined up for me in hindsight. As I was going through my master's, I certainly realized that there were kind of aspects to legal training that were actually becoming quite useful because I didn't have a science background. I didn't know how to critically appraise a paper's methodology because I didn't know anything about methodology. Um, but what I did have was the fact that law is quite similar at an epistemic level to science. We're both asking questions. We need to set a certain threshold of evidence to determine that question. And it's just that the type of evidence that we gather is different. So I saw those similarities on my master's, and I was like, okay, I can learn the nitty-gritty parts of methodology and science. But what I do have already is a kind of particular training in, the concept of evidence, rules of evidence. That was very much not just, oh, here's a study that shows this. My question was always, but how does it show that? Why does it show it? And of course, that's kind of essentially the legal training that you get as a lawyer. You can't just wander into court and say, I have evidence. The defendant is not guilty. You have to actually produce and prove the provenance and the probity of that evidence in order for it to be accepted as evidence. So that really stood to me. And then over time, I do think I very much am thankful for the fact that I had that kind of training and experience in a different discipline because it very much has colored my entire approach to science, thinking about research, thinking about evidence itself, and of course trying to then bring that back around to the public domain, with some of the kind of science communication work that I do.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll probably come back to that a little bit toward the end because I want to hear your thoughts about social media. But before we run away with that topic and get too hot-headed, let's just talk more about nutrition broadly. I feel like when it comes to nutrition, there's a lot of confusion out there. At least people tend to feel confused based on what they're seeing. However, the more that I've listened to experts such as yourself and others, the more it seems that there really is some scientific consensus, at least about certain things. So, as far as nutrition is concerned, what can we say with the greatest amount of confidence? And of those things that we can claim confidently, what are the most important considerations that you would say when it comes to when it comes to eating healthily? What are the most important things to consider?
Yeah, it's that point about what you just said about consensus. It's always wild to me that we have this topic that in the public domain is so controversial, and in the actual research domain is just a lot of low-hanging fruit that we have broad consensus on. So some of those things, for example, like I would say the most incontrovertible fact in nutrition science is that eating more non-starchy vegetables and fruit of a wide variety of colors is the best step an individual can do for their health, independent of any other characteristics of their diet. In the UK, we have this kind of public health recommendation of 5 a day. They call it 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. That tallies to around 400 grams in gram amount. It's just you can't say 400 grams to people in the Gen Pop because they don't know what that is. But if you actually look at 400 grams of fruit and vegetables, it's really not a lot to someone that would eat a broadly healthy diet or even a kind of diet with a lot more kind of plant sources. It is not a lot of food. And yet, our in the UK anyway, our population average here is about 260 grams. So people are essentially just over half of that. And the health gain that would occur across the whole population if we were just able to get people up to that amount would be quite substantial in terms of lowering the burden of disease. So that's incontrovertible. Then we have kind of on the flip side to that, I would say probably the most well-established nutrient of concern, to put it that way, would be the adverse health effects of a high sodium diet. There was a global burden of disease study published a couple of years ago looking at deaths attributable to kind of dietary risk factors from 1990 to 2019. And of that, globally, whether you're in a high income or low income country, middle income country, it was actually more pronounced in low middle income countries. High sodium diets, was of all the dietary characteristics, the leading contributor to mortality and morbidity related to diet. So that I would say we could hang our hat on as people do not want high sodium diets generally. And then if we swing back to broad consensus on what is good, I think next in line would probably be whole grains, and that kind of broad family where we just have pretty robust evidence across the board, whether it's long-term population studies looking at health outcomes, whether they're metabolic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, whole grains just uniformly associated with lower risk. And then I think to go back to kind of nutrients of concern, although there's not as much consensus with this, that's typically because the evidence can be a little murky. But when you reconcile the apparent conflicts in the evidence, a clearer picture emerges, and that's in relation to saturated fat and health. The reason it's less obvious now is because public health campaigns for people to lower their saturated fat have largely been successful. But you go back to the 1950s, 60s, people consuming 20% of their daily energy from saturated fat, which was very strongly associated with heart disease, coronary heart disease mortality. So I would say broadly, and then in a more dietary pattern sense. So I've kind of singled out particular food groups and nutrients. I think at the level of dietary patterns, we've got the basic kind of consensus, which has been the consensus in nutrition really since dietary guidelines formed, is that where the bulk of the diet is from plant sources of foods, whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, that is a dietary pattern that is broadly conducive to health and lower disease risk. And there are certain dietary patterns then that tend to reflect that. The traditional Japanese diet was one that was always common and kind of popular in nutrition. The Mediterranean diet, although the problem with that is it's kind of, in nutrition research, they've kind of removed the diversity from the Mediterranean region, which goes, from the south of Spain to Lebanon, and they've kind of condensed. Basically, the Mediterranean diet, as we popularize it in nutrition, is the kind of like Southern Italian diet more than anything. It's not really a regional diet. It's like, what were they eating in Italy and Greece in the 1960s? That's kind of what the diet is. So, I think those dietary patterns, though, are again broadly conducive to health. So again, there's a lot of consensus there, and the controversy tends to be arguments over specific foods. Although there has always been controversy in nutrition, what I've seen, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years is an evolution. If you go back 10, 15 years ago, the blogosphere was exploding, say 2008, 2009. The big debate then was like the macronutrient debate. It was fat versus carbohydrate. Should you eat more fat or less fat? Should you eat more carbs or less carbs? What sources of fat should you eat if you're eating more fat, etc.? Now we've kind of evolved that, and the defining debate of our age, I would say, is the source of your food. And we've got a kind of animal plant dichotomy in that regard. And that's very much the kind of major crux, I think, of more contemporary debates in nutrition. It's less about macronutrients, it's more about the source of the food.
That's interesting that you point that out. In a previous episode, I stressed that like perfection is not the goal, that like anybody who's looking to eat more plant-based by, increasing whole grains, vegetables, legumes, fruits, etc., nuts and seeds, and reduce animal intake, it's like not about whether you're 100%, it's more about the emphasizing, like you were saying, these incontrovertible facts
Mm,
of nutrition, that if you emphasize these healthful foods and minimize, say, sources of sodium and saturated fat, you're
mm,
by
yeah,
default like
by
eating
default.
less animals.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that like I think we all need to learn how to dwell in this more complex nuanced space of, instead of jumping on a bandwagon or being part of a diet tribe and having to place this label on yourself,
Mm.
being able to recognize that you can enjoy a variety of foods, but just place the emphasis in the right place. And hopefully you'll be doing something better for your body as well as for the environment.
Yeah, and it's I think part of the problem is the label plant-based because it's relatively opaque, right? Does that mean we're describing someone who is plant exclusive, or does that mean we're describing someone who's lacto-vegetarian and consumes dairy, or lacto-ovo-vegetarian and consumes eggs and dairy, or pescatarian and maybe consumes only fish, or maybe consumes any combination of fish, dairy, and eggs? Like there's such broad characteristics of vegetarianism in particular and how that kind of arises as a dietary pattern. And I think that's plant-based has also then become synonymous with kind of plant exclusive. And I've joked about this sometimes with, if we're looking at the first, national dietary guidelines that were introduced, the States in 1977, and then the UK followed on its heels in the early 80s, 1983. Those dietary guidelines, we can call them plant-based. The pyramid, as it was back then, was based upon plants, so to speak. So the soundness of our nutrition advice has always essentially been based upon plants. Um, and again, those kind of healthy dietary patterns that we were referencing there, none of these are you can't find traditional dietary patterns that are plant exclusive for a variety of reasons. Um, so all of these dietary patterns do contain proportions of foods of animal origin. What tends to separate them is what are those foods, in what amounts, and in that sense, a diet that would have been consumed by people living in Finland in the 1970s was very different to the diet being consumed by people living on the island of Crete in the 60s or 70s. So those kind of regional differences have been flattened by globalization. And typically in what we might call the West, as a kind of broad, geopolitical entity, most of our
Mm.
diets are relatively homogenous. My brother lives in Chicago, for example. If you compared my diet to his, broadly speaking, in a general sense, or if you compared the average person in, it's probably not a good compare, but if you compare the average person in Chicago, say, to the average person in the UK population, you're going to find relatively similar dietary characteristics.
Yeah.
And that's a result of industrialization, it's a result of globalization. So our food supplies and diversity in our intakes have been flattened. And funnily enough, I was speaking with a friend a while ago who's an Italian nutrition researcher, and they were laughing about this idea of a Mediterranean diet, and they were just like, "Well, it's just McDonald's." Like as in what he sees around his city in Italy is just the typical Western diet that you would see if
Yeah.
you arrived in London tomorrow or if you arrived in New York on Saturday.
Yeah. That's a great point. That, yeah, we have to define our terms very carefully,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Something
absolutely.
something like carnivore is very clear what it is
Hmm.
for and against,
Yeah.
whereas yes, plant-based has come to mean a whole variety of things, and it's
Mm.
important to clarify. Or even, yeah, Mediterranean, whatever term you decide to choose. Um, I'm curious because of particularly the environmental burden of something like beef or lamb, like when if you look at an our world and data chart, it's just very clear
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
much red meat is affecting the environment, you know, compared to other animals, even if people decide to continue to eat animal products or even dairy for that matter. But
Mm.
um, what can you tell us about red meat in terms of its nutritional impact or profile? As far as like, I think some people would be like, well, if it's bad for the environment but really good for my health, then how do I square that? And I'm not trying to like pigeonhole or like
Mm.
shoehorn something into like this must align with our environmental um, data. But I'm curious for our listeners to hear more about like what do we need to know about the health impacts of the largest emitter?
Yeah, so we typically would stratify red meat according to whether it's processed or unprocessed. Now, I've seen people kind of conflate the word processing, which they assume that it means like McDonald's essentially, like that level of processing. That's actually not, that is, of course, we could describe that as processed meat, but it's not the kind of characteristics of processing that would give any meat the designation of processed meat. Processed meat is any meat that has been dried, cured, salted, or any sort, or smoked, for example, any sort of meat that would have undergone a process like that for preservation or to produce a particular type of food. So, salami is a processed meat, chorizo is a processed meat, smoked salmon. There's been a debate, does smoked fish count as this? Because it's fish, not meat. And it's like it's the smoking of the food that would be the kind of concern, certainly from a carcinogenic perspective. For processed meat in particular, we now have pretty convincing evidence, and again, consensus in regard to processed meat that high amounts, which would be defined as about over 50 grams a day, which is not a huge amount at all.
Yeah.
So relatively small amounts of processed meat consumed regularly over time are associated with significantly higher colorectal cancer risk, several other kind of specific cancer site outcomes, and cardiovascular disease risk and type 2 diabetes risk. So I think we could really kind of at this point have a fair degree of consensus in relation to the role of processed meat. Where things have been more debated is in relation to unprocessed or what we might call fresh meat. So this is, a fillet steak that has not been, salted, cured, or anything that someone is buying fresh and is, cooking, possibly in the home or whatever. And this has been a little trickier for several reasons. One of which is that a general characteristic of looking at nutrition research is typically nothing exists in a vacuum. No food in and of itself as a result of its nutritional profile, because we do need nutrients for life. There's no food that just because of the nature of the food or the name of the food is inherently harmful. There's no such thing as a nutrient. Like I mentioned sodium earlier. Sodium's not inherently harmful. We require it. We just require very, modest amounts to be obtained endogenous or from the diet. And we have endogenously very tightly regulated systems in the body to preserve whatever sodium we have. So no nutrient in a saturated fat. Saturated fat is not in and of itself harmful, but at certain thresholds of intake, if it constitutes, a large proportion of someone's daily energy, then then it's a problem. And the same principle applies to specific foods. And this is where kind of I think people get wrong when they hear that a food is adversely associated with health outcomes or may increase risk of X, Y, Z. And you'll hear people kind of make these kind of naturalistic fallacy arguments like, oh, how could something natural be bad for you, so to speak? Well, it's not that it in and of itself is harmful. It's that at certain thresholds of intake, there is a risk. And it is the case with unprocessed red meat. Some of the inconsistency in the evidence actually reflects the fact that in some populations, they don't actually have particularly high levels of red meat consumption. So if you've got a cohort study of Japanese participants and you're looking at the association between red meat and cardiovascular disease in that cohort, you may not find anything. But when you look at their average levels of red meat intake, the highest level of intake in that group might be like 70 grams a day.
It's not a particularly large amount. If you look at the North American cohorts on red meat intake, we consistently see risk related to multiple cardiometabolic and cancer outcomes. But the thresholds of intake in the highest group, highest kind of categories of meat consumers is over 180 grams a day. Factoring in underestimation, that typically is the case with observational dietary assessments, people are likely consuming more than that, over 200 grams plus a day. So at those levels of intake, and then if you take those thresholds and you start to say, okay, what happens if we think about the relationship with this, with red meat and these thresholds, and you look at the European populations, you can see the same associations present themselves at those thresholds. So I think at this point, we can say that individuals consuming high red meat diets, which are now very vogue on social media, these are not benign. It doesn't matter that they're not processed meats. There are other mechanisms by which high levels of unprocessed meat would relate to risks, such as the heme iron content, the formation of N-nitroso compounds that interact with that heme iron in the gastrointestinal tract, and potentially cooking methods that have a role as well. It does have, obviously, for fattier cuts, the saturated fat content, etc. So I think at this point, when we are a little more refined with how we parse that literature and resolve some of the apparent inconsistencies, we can see that there is a relationship. There probably isn't at under 100 grams a day, but that's typically not what people in these kind of like meat emphasizing diets are eating, because less than 100 grams a day is a fairly minuscule, it's an amount of meat that's probably the size of kind of like the palm of your hand.
Yeah, or if people think about a quarter pound burger, like a quarter of a pound is
Right.
more
A
than
quarter
100
of a pound,
is
right?
more than
Yeah.
100 grams
It's
because
like, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
100.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's
So
about, yeah, it's so that I think would be a more up-to-date position in relation to red meat. And so, again, where someone consuming a high meat diet, then there's both of those considerations enter the frame. You've got the environmental footprint of consistently consuming, over 200 grams of red meat a day, every day. And then you've got the potential, health implications of that kind of dietary pattern over time.
that's really helpful. And one thing that came to mind too is like as we were talking about some of the benefits for particular nutrients or types of food versus those that are known to be deleterious to our health. Like you're saying, we don't live in a vacuum, we don't eat in a vacuum. If you're not eating this, you're eating more of that, and vice versa. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're choosing to eat more red meat, then you're probably eating less legumes and whole grains and non-starchy vegetables, etc. Whereas if you're emphasizing more of those plant foods rich in fiber and polyphenols and whatnot, then you're going to get those benefits while you're also reducing um, the intake of those, the heme iron and et cetera, that could be harmful on the other side.
Yes, and so you've raised a really important principle in relation to nutrition research generally and how we actually go about doing some of these analyses, which is that inherently, because we need a certain amount of energy to live, no one's gonna, if you stop eating one food or you reduce an amount of a food, there is always going to be a replacement effect, because otherwise people would just be, deciding to have a bunch of foods out of their diet or completely exclude them. And maybe, suddenly they're eating, 600-700 less calories a day or whatever. They're going to want to make up that energy. So there's always this implication of if someone's choosing to reduce food A and exclude entirely food B, they're going to be replacing those with food C and D. And those replacement effects or those substitution effects are actually crucial in determining the long-term health kind of outcomes of specific foods and diets. And generally speaking, across the board, especially when it would come to foods like red meat, like I don't think I've seen a substitution analysis where red meat has been modeled as being replaced by, a legume or whole grain or not, vegetables, and and the vegetables are not associated, or the whole grains or the plant food are not associated with lower risk. So there's generally this kind of like net benefit to lowering high levels of, for individuals consuming high levels of red meat, there's generally net benefits to that reduction because of the replacement benefits, as long as they're not, oh, I'm going to lower my unprocessed red meat intake and replace it with bacon, which in the crazy world of nutrition is probably not beyond the realm of possibility, but that's generally not what people are intending to do. So there's generally a net benefit to the reduction of, specifically foods like, red meat, including unprocessed meats, and replacing those foods with plant foods, because you're suddenly getting additional fiber, you're suddenly getting additional, as you said, like polyphenols, bioactive food components, a different nutritional profile altogether.
Yeah, terrific. To switch gears just a tad bit here, I recall hearing you share during a conversation that you had with Simon Hill and Drew Harrisberg that the environmental impact of food plays a role in how you personally decide to eat. And with an education in nutrition, I would imagine that nutritional factors are likely the primary decision-making factor for you in your day-to-day food choices. But could you speak a little bit to the role that
Mm.
environmental factors play for your own food choices?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you mentioned our world in data a few minutes ago, and I think when you see data like that, a part of the conversation with Drew and Simon at the time that I probably didn't articulate particularly well on that podcast, because I think we were about 3 hours in and my brain was starting to leak out of my ears. Um, well, but part of what we were discussing, kind of even offline, was, the idea, because Drew had basically, said to me along the lines of, do you not find the kind of ethical aspects to this far more persuasive? And my response was no, because there's you're wading into the realm of moral philosophy and various kind of frameworks we're considering. And I know that, there's very persuasive arguments in that respect. But if you're asking me what's easier to look at and have a kind of an immediate sense of this is something I can action, I mean, a data-driven chart like the ones you would see on something like Our World in Data is far more immediate and persuasive to me than the wrangling of kind of, philosophical kind of arguments around ethical frameworks and kind of the morality related to eating. So that is something that very much kind of jumped out at me. I was already probably 5, 6, 7 years ago starting to make transitions in my own diet that were very much more related to nutritional factors. Like they were the driving decision. Like I was deliberately starting to eat more legumes, for example, on a day-to-day basis, because I was like, shit, like this research, like I'm an idiot. And partly like, I wasn't from a country and a culture that like in Ireland, I mean, oats is as good as it gets as far as us, we're not a population that like lentils are, kind of sitting there as part of the kind of the cultural meal plan. And so, this was as much a kind of a culinary experiment for me as well. I was kind of enjoying, I'd eaten fairly repetitive diet for kind of, sports and training, and I'd kind of gotten sick of that. I'd been doing that for most of my 20s, and I was kind of over that kind of you're eating to fuel. And I was kind of like, I'm kind of over that now. I'd like to actually enjoy what I'm eating.
Yeah.
um, um, so that was a part of it, but very much nutritionally driven. Like, oh, I should really be upping my fiber intake. What foods will help me get there? Okay, cool. So those kind of decisions are starting to like shape a change in my diet. And then really, I do think that for certain foods, I never would have eaten particularly high daily amounts of red meat. But I would have eaten much higher daily amounts of white meats. And even at that, I was kind of looking at this going, well, this is pretty consistent. Okay, red meat's particularly, beef is particularly deleterious environmentally. But actually, if you go down through almost every source, kind of, animal-based protein, then you're kind of into, like, it's kind of staring you in the face as, you know, the greenhouse gas emission footprint, the land use, the, you know, wider impacts kind of environmentally in terms of runoff and all of this kind of coalesces together, which to me was a particularly persuasive argument for a further adjustment that wasn't just thinking about the nutritional aspects of the diet and was actually starting to think about how are those individual choices I'm making adding up. You know, and you know, I'm under no illusions. Like the idea that we're all going to individually kind of make changes that will have a material impact on the unfortunate trajectory we're heading is a fantasy. Like I know that we need top-down solutions. I know that we need government-led, responsible actors. I know that we need, you know, individual solutions or I know that we need kind of top-down, you know, systems level and policy solutions, and that the individual factors are kind of a part you're contributing. But you still have to contribute to that in a sense, right? You can't say, well, we need top-down policy solutions, so fuck it, I'm just going to eat whatever I like, right? There has to be bottoms-up effort as well in order to kind of have the top-down solutions be meaningful. So that very much spurred in more recent years. And then there was a publication in 2019, 2020-ish of the kind of Eat Lancet, you know, planetary health. And there are issues with that. It's not perfect, but as a rough guide, it became my heuristic for shaping my diet going forward. So my diet now would be best described in a nutrition label as lacto-pescatarian. So I would consume fish 2, maybe 3 times a week. But for dairy, for example, I wouldn't consume more than the recommended amounts in the Eat Lancet guidelines. So I'd use their modeling as a rough guide of try not to exceed these thresholds. You know, for example, I think they had it as like a cup, give or take 250 grams a day, as the like this could be within the parameters of the planetary health guideline. And I was like, okay, let's aim for that then, and let's not aim to kind of over. And then, of course, like you say, there are implications, there are substitution and replacement benefits that come from that then, and you're kind of consuming more legumes, or you know, you're consuming more nuts or seeds or whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's been a progressive evolution that very much does consider the nutritional factors involved, does consider the nutritional components involved, but very much has in recent years been shaped in terms of amount, in terms of frequency and stuff like that by some of the kind of, you know, nutrition and planetary health reports that we have.
Yeah, I find it encouraging that by and large, the nutritional evidence seems to align with what appears to be the best way to eat for planetary health, that we don't necessarily have to draw these super strict lines in the sand that you have to eat plant exclusive and you can never eat this thing ever again. But that, again, this idea of what we emphasize and just recognizing the entire planet cannot house enough cows to feed people the way that the westernized countries tend to eat meat, and the more wealthy a nation tends to get, the more they typically eat of meat. And so to make people, like you're saying, we need those top-down approaches, but it's also important for the individual to in a sense like vote with their dollars, but also just live in alignment with what they see around them. I think it gives us a sense of hope when we don't just I don't know, live in this pessimistic sense, like, oh, well, someone else is going to have to do something about that. It's
yes.
like, well, you've got to start with yourself.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And it is, you know, that there's the kind of, you know, if you can, you must component. But I do think the reason that's relevant is one thing that I'm always very conscious on. It's a drum that I beat on a lot with regard to nutrition and public health is, you know, when you stratify a lot of population health and when you stratify the nutritional relationship with population health, it is inseparable from class divides in our societies. So I do this because I recognize that I am in a position to make those changes, but I would never assume that like a single mother of 2 on a low income,
is in a position to even start thinking about like, oh, my environmental footprint. So I'm always very, like conscious that the people who can make changes, if they can, great. But so much of what's an issue with our food systems is this unfair system, economic system that we have. And of course, they're the people that ultimately will be the biggest beneficiaries of kind of top-down policy-based reform and interventions. Um, so we need people to kind of like, retain that sense of the realities of our food supply and go to bat for people that can't. And it's the great tragedy of the post-Second World War kind of industrial period is we created these food supplies that will give us abundance and will give us plenty, and we are not in any sort of threat of, and yet we created food systems that will disproportionately impact people in the lower 50% of income strata in the population and otherwise. And that's because food budgets, unfortunately, are for many people a modifiable aspect of their budget, but their rent isn't, and paying bills to keep the lights on isn't. And so we've had a really tragic situation in the UK over the last few years where food poverty has been getting really bad, where people accessing food banks are at the mercy of whatever is being donated to that food bank. So they don't have the luxury of any of these kind of choices. But B, a lot of them are parents that are, for example, in employment, which completely shifted the demographic of food bank use. But they're making decisions to buy just enough food with the remaining food budget to feed their kids, and then the parents are accessing food banks to feed themselves. So it's really tragic and quite kind of grotesque given how much food availability we have in our societies, levels of food poverty, and America is particularly bad for this as well. So, I think in the conversation of the environmental justice component, and as that relates to nutrition, we're not going to solve anything until we've kept that front and center in our kind of minds is like, where is action needed and who needs it the most? Um, and that relates to our globalized food systems. It's not they're not clearing forests in Colorado to make beef farms. They're doing it in Brazil. So again, the need for policy, like globalization itself, is as much of a problem. And like you said, when low middle income countries start to increase their kind of overall national wealth, they want more meat. And McDonald's suddenly appears on every corner. And these are systemic issues with our food supply. So yeah, I think it's great that people do what they can at an individual level, but we also need collective action and mobilization upstream to kind of, like you said, vote with dollars, but yeah, I don't know, bang on doors, write to Congress, write to Congressman. I don't know.
Amen. Yeah, I hope to get some people on the podcast to talk a bit more about that, because that's something that I know is so important, but I personally don't know as much about. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's such an important factor. I think that a lot of us can overlook when we're kind of insulated in our own city or suburbia or whatever, whatever is keeping us, some of us at least, from being as aware of those discrepancies. If you don't mind switching over to the social media conversation that we've been holding the door back on, I imagine that you would agree that it's unfortunate these days that so many people are relying on social media and YouTube for their nutrition advice. I also know that you have a thorough list of red flags for spotting quacks. So, are there any highlights that you'd like to share with our listeners in terms of how they can guard from falling prey to nutrition quacks?
Yes. So actually, we now have some really low-hanging fruit. If they have taken any aspect of their clothes off, I think that's a good place to start. If they've taken clothes off and have walked into a supermarket, that's just a hard pass. If they've taken clothes off, walked into a supermarket and are shouting at vegetables and other generally accepted healthy foods, then that's a major hall pass. And Yeah, so behavior, I think, on social media is a really, really kind of important cue, and how people are presenting. Um, there's multiple others we could go through. I think I would generally be skeptical of broad sweeping narratives around diet, whether that's related to, for example, ancestral health. Like we've kind of got an idea maybe of what happened in our evolutionary kind of past, but we piece it together through different, scientific methods, and there's shades of gray. We're never going to fill them in, but it's kind of cool sounding in a way, some of the kind of evolutionary stuff. So it's easy marketing fodder. I would be skeptical of every and all claims that come attached with something related to the word evolution or ancestry or otherwise. Um, and I would be particularly skeptical as well of people, and this isn't necessarily related to any particular location on the spectrum of diet, because you'd see this from the kind of vegan kind of hardcore kind of plant on the, shall we call it the far left of the nutrition spectrum, as much as the kind of carnivore red meat far right of the nutrition spectrum, which is this really kind of conspiratorial, like uh anti kind of government, anti guidelines view of nutrition. It's very much often tied into kind of a rhetoric of like, you know, anti kind of pharmaceutical, big pharma, this kind of stuff. I would be skeptical of those kind of narratives as well. Listen, it's not like the pharmaceutical industry or the food industry are our friends the entire time, but the idea that there is kind of, you know, I don't know, a willful conspiracy afoot to, render us all as kind of, budding diabetics in order to provide us medication is just something that tends to, with the nutrition advice that attaches to that, at least for me, be a red flag. And then there's things like making absolute statements. Like no one in science, no one in research makes absolutist statements. Like even going back to some of the topics we've discussed today, like I could have said, yeah, unprocessed red meat will kill you. Like, but that's not the answer, right? The answer is that, like, hey, we've got risk at these thresholds. We might not see risk at these thresholds, and that's the answer. That doesn't do well on social media. Um, so absolutist statements to me is always a red flag. And communicating the way that people interact as well. If you come across a new page, and maybe it's not necessarily immediately having any of these aesthetic warnings, so to speak, the kind of presentation warnings that you might get, and they appear convincing as to whatever their narrative might be, a good litmus test, I think, is always to actually probe an individual. And I say this to people a lot: ask a question. Oh, what evidence supports this claim? How does that evidence support this claim? You don't have to be an expert to ask that question. No one has to be an expert to ask that question. How they respond will typically give the game away. Because if someone asks me that question, or other, science communicators that I know that are, really about trying to do the right thing in this area, then you will take the time to say and explain, okay, these are these studies, and this is why we can know what we know. And you kind of would actually take the time to work through it. What I've typically noticed with quacks is that they'll go on the defensive immediately. So someone will get some shitty answer like, oh, you can use Google or check PubMed, or they'll kind of fob them off. If anyone interacts like that and they're supposedly there talking about the research and the science, that's a hard no. I think that's a great indication that you're on to someone who's not a good faith actor.
What if someone throws an abstract at you? It's from one particular paper and says, look at this quote study.
Mm. Well, then in that case, that's where there's two kind of related questions. So I just said what evidence supports this, and how does it support that? It's the second limb. If they throw the abstract, that's where the second limb of this question comes in. Because again, you're representing to this person that you're not an expert, but you're interested, and you're saying, listen, you've thrown the abstract. I would never throw an abstract at someone who asks me. I would explain to them what it is that I am saying supports it. I could provide them the citation, sure, but I'm never answering to someone by throwing them an abstract. That speaks to me that they actually don't know what they're talking about and more than likely haven't read the paper. So I would be pushing that second limb of the question, like how, okay, thanks for the abstract, but how does this study actually show it? Likely they'll just come back and repeat like a line from the results section of the abstract, right? They're not actually going into detail. They're not able to go into that detail, and they probably haven't read the full paper.
That's super helpful. Thanks for that. Um, I imagine that listeners would be curious for someone like yourself who has all the education that you do in nutrition. What does a typical day or week's worth of food look like? You don't have to like go through every day, obviously, but just generally like speaking, I know you'd mentioned that you'll eat fish a few times a day, that you started to introduce more legumes years ago. But yeah, what do you typically have in your fridge, pantry, or on your plate?
So kind of average day. During the week I can be a creature of habit just for getting on with work and life. So especially right now because it's warm here. So typical kind of weekday breakfast would be overnight oats, which I have with jumbo oats, um, some non-fat Greek yogurt, some soy milk, a banana, blueberries, and some peanut butter. And I just mix that the night before and I toss it in the fridge. And that's always breakfast, pretty much Monday to at least Thursday. Um, Lunch typically would be some form of kind of legume, veg, and then there would generally be some form of kind of more plant protein on top of that, like a tofu or paneer even. And then dinner is where it kind of really varies. So I don't know if you guys have corn in America, which are a company that do like meat alternative, plant-based meat alternative
Mm-hmm.
products. And their range of products they have here now is phenomenal. They have incredible mince, and they have these kind of chicken pieces that are just again like what they've done very well is kind of replicate like texture. And so dinner will typically be something like like a chili with corn mince, or maybe like a chicken curry with the corn chicken. Um, yeah, something like that. I make a lot of South Asian food, um, and just generally like that cooking, and it
Yeah.
lends itself quite nicely then to kind of like the obviously more vegetarian eating. And then, of course, on one of those nights, it might be something like some salmon fillets that I've like baked in the oven or something like that.
Yeah, I like that you emphasize the style of cooking, like something like South Asian. It does lend
Mm.
itself really well to emphasizing plants. I feel like when people start to reduce their particularly like red meat and other meat intake and try to make swaps, sometimes they go too much to like, well, how do I recreate, this or that? Like you can, like you're saying, this company, is it corn with with a Q?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah.
it. Yeah.
So yeah, we're not talking about sweet corn, folks. So it's
No.
like, yeah, different, like it's a plant-based meat replacement product that you're like, so you could do something like that or something like lentils where you're throwing it into,
Yeah.
replace something, but at the same time on the, other side of the coin, there's certain ethnic food, like food,
Mm.
I say ethnic because we're from Ireland and
Yeah.
America,
Either. Yeah.
respectively.
Yeah.
That there's a lot more exciting flavor combinations of things you can do, just like making the veg
Yeah.
and plants the star, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. And my partner's Iranian, and like the Persian cooking is similarly like just delicious, right? So it's like
So
you
much
just take,
flavor.
yeah, so much flavor. So it's kind of like, yeah, you just take inspiration from that. And then what I like about the plant-based meat alternatives is that they give you the space to, like, you could, for example, like you could take a chicken curry recipe and you could easily just substitute, say, the tofu for the chicken, right? Um, but it does give you that scope as well. Like the corn mince, for example, is great if you like in winter you want something like a kind of shepherd's pie or a cottage pie or something that's kind of like quite, warming and wintry. And it just takes there's slight differences in like cooking. Like if you're cooking with that kind of mince, it tends to like hold a bit of water more. So if you
if you have like a recipe that involves, say, adding like a kind of a chili sauce or something that you've made, you need to add less sauce because that there will be some moisture from the mince as it cooks in the pan. So otherwise it'll be too watery if you add. But like once you get around those little quirks to using it, you can really recreate without any sort of compromise the kind of texture and stuff that you would if you were making like a chili, like a kind of minced chili. So they've provided a great scope for people. I think they've made it very easy to be able to have, and particularly for me, because I still do, train, is quite kind of regularly. And I would still always have a kind of radar for like making sure I'm getting enough protein. And that can be something that when people do start like replacing a lot of, kind of easier sources of plant protein or sorry, animal source protein with plant sources of protein, that they can often, and I do appreciate this, be kind of, well, where am I going to get my protein from? There are, of course, multiple ways that you can do that. But these products do make it very helpful for people to kind of have that additive effect on top of, tofu or tempeh or other kind of, paneer if someone eats it and stuff like that.
Yeah, super helpful. Is there any particular food or flavor combination that you've been like really enjoying lately?
Food or flavor combination lately? Uh, yeah, there's this rice that my partner's mom makes, which is like, it's basically like broad beans and saffron. It's like an Iranian style of rice, but it's like, because rice is rice, right? You need to you need to kind of like, we need to find ways to like jazz up rice. And this is for me, it's just I can eat this by the bucket load if it's available. So that is, yeah, I think, yeah, that kind of saffron addition is absolutely delicious. And then yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go with saffron as a theme because I was also in Spain recently for a couple of weeks, and like when you've got a paella that's like got that like saffron going through it, and you're just like, oh, it just really adds that kind of flavor.
Well, I just think it's fun to ask people what they're kind of been into lately and
Yeah.
gives people some inspiration. And it just goes to show that flavor is everything and that, yeah,
Hmm.
it's the spices that really can make a big difference. Alan, is there anything else that you'd like listeners to know that we didn't get a chance to dive into?
No, I don't think so. I just, I'd always say with the caveat, just be careful online and be wary about where you get your information from. And I think a good heuristic is to remember that conversation we started this with, which is there's far more consensus than controversy. And if you're in a place where you think nutrition's all controversy and contention, then possibly spending too much time online. So, yeah, a good reminder is no, there is agreement here. We kind of know, we know the broad stuff.
Perfect. Well, if people are interested in learning a bit more about what you're up to or finding things that you have done or written or said, where can they find more?
So on social media, I pretty much keep it only to Instagram. So you could find me at the Nutritional Advocate, all one word. And then from there, you could, if you're interested, find links to Alinea Nutrition, which is my education hub, where we have like a weekly review of a recent study that came out in nutrition science, and kind of research lectures and stuff like that. And you can also find me at Sigma Nutrition with Danny Lennon, where we have relatively frequently podcasts coming out, and they're all available on Spotify or Apple iTunes or whatever podcast platform someone listens to.
Perfect. Thanks again, Dr. Alan Flanagan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you have questions or topics you'd like me to address here on Eating for Eden, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to edenandme@substack.com. Also, if you've been enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a review. It's a great help for getting these important words out to others. Finally, become an email subscriber on Substack to have new episodes delivered directly to your inbox. That's all for now, friends. Until next time, be well. Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.